Helen of Troy is one of the most controversial figures in Greek mythology, a woman of unparalleled beauty known as the face to launch 1,000 ships, and perhaps the figure alongside Paris that is held as most accountable for the destruction and sack of Troy. But whether Helen was an unwilling victim or a conniving vixen, we will never know. But it is safe to say that Helen is a name that will forever be synonymous with Troy. But her story does not end there, and Helen lived for a number of years after the fall of Troy. And this video will go into detail about the various theories that have existed regarding the enigmatic death and final fate of Helen of Troy, or Helen of Sparta, which I think is probably the more accurate title for her. So the first theory we will be considering here is by far the most far-fetched and improbable theory in this list. But it is an interesting one nonetheless, and it is a theory proposed by Herodotus himself, so it should at least be considered if not taken seriously. Herodotus hypothesizes that after Paris had kidnapped Helen from Sparta, his boat got blown off course and he landed in Egypt, which is a massive diversion by any standards. And it sets the tone of the improbability of the rest of this theory. So after getting blown off course and landing in Egypt, the king of Egypt, Proteus, discovers that Paris has broken all rules of morality by stealing Helen from Menelaus, and he refuses to allow Paris to take Helen back to Troy with him. Accepting this change in circumstances, Paris is then forced to return back to Troy empty-handed and brideless. But unfortunately for Paris, his troubles do not end there, as the Greek commanders don't seem to get the memo that Helen is in Egypt and a 10-year-long siege of Troy begins. And I'm sure during this time, Paris, King Priam and Hector all tried their best to convince Menelaus, Agamemnon and the other Greek commanders that Helen was not in Troy and that she's actually in Egypt. But undoubtedly, that would sound as ridiculous to them as it does to us today. But this does lead to another interesting plot hole in Herodotus' theory, and that is, what was Helen doing in Egypt for 10 years while this war was going on? Surely at some point she could have traveled to Troy and shown herself to Menelaus. King Proteus could have sent envoys from Egypt to the Greek commanders, and if they were too lazy to do any of this, they could have just simply sent a letter saying, Helen is in Egypt, come pick her up whenever you're ready, thank you. But of course, none of these options occurred to anyone in Egypt, and after 10 long years, Agamemnon and Menelaus eventually break through the fortifications of Troy and kill the majority of the innocent citizens and burn the city to the ground. And after realizing that Paris was telling the truth and Helen wasn't in Troy, I am sure they felt really silly, to put it mildly. So Menelaus after this point would gather all his forces and hop on his first ship he could find to Egypt, where he would go and find Helen waiting for him, looking plump and well fed since she has been doing absolutely nothing for 10 years. And Herodotus ends this theory by stating that both Menelaus and Helen returned to Sparta and spend the rest of their lives together in holy matrimony. Like I said, a ridiculous theory from the beginning right to the end, but it is an amusing and interesting one nonetheless, and one that I felt that should be shared within this video. So the second theory we will be considering is actually from the Odyssey, and it reaches the same endpoint of Helen living happily ever after in Sparta after the fall of Troy. But the Odyssey does highlight that even though the happy couple did have a daughter, the only stain on their marriage, even more than her supposed affair with Paris, is the fact that her and Menelaus never produced a son. An interesting addition to this theory I found online was that initially, Menelaus was furious with Helen for her betrayal, and to protect his honor he was ready to kill her, and he drew out his sword to deliver a killing blow. But Helen used her years of experience of wingmen and quickly took off her robe and kneeled before him in acceptance and humility, ready to receive the killing blow. But let's just say Menelaus was left a bit awe-inspired by her beauty and was unable to deliver this final fatal blow, and they reconciled after this and lived together in Sparta till the end of their days. But anyone familiar with Greek mythology will know that death is not the end of an individual's journey but the start of a new one. And one theory elaborates this concept even further by stating that after the end of their mortal lives, Menelaus was sent to Elysium to spend the eternity of his afterlife, and Helen actually gets promoted to goddess status and she decides that alongside her new goddess promotion, she deserves an upgrade in husband as well, and becomes the bride of none other than Achilles, the greatest warrior in Greek mythology. It seems that even in death, Helen's beauty would ensure that she got what she wanted when she wanted. So, as I'm sure you have all noticed by this point, all these endings seem to agree that Helen lived a very comfortable and peaceful life after all the destruction and death that occurred all across the Greek world on her behalf. Surely someone out there would want her to be held accountable for all these atrocities and may even attempt to seek out justice by their own hand. And according to the work of Euripides the Oreste, Menelaus' nephew was incensed by the lack of consequences faced by Helen on her return to Sparta, and therefore he felt he had no option but to devise a plot to assassinate Helen himself. And he actually got very close to completing his objective. But unfortunately for Menelaus' nephew, Apollo intervenes in the last minute and saves her life, once again being saved by divine intervention. It really does seem like Helen will never have to face any consequences for starting the Trojan War, or will she? Introducing the final and my personal favorite theory of what happened to Helen after the fall of Troy, which is after the death of Menelaus, Helen gets exiled from Sparta by her stepsons, who absolutely loathe her and want her out of the city as soon as possible. And with little options available to her, Helen heads to Rhodes to take refuge with her old and dear friend Polyxo. But unbeknown to her, Polyxo has actually been harboring a deep-rooted hatred of Helen, as her husband Tlepolemus was killed during the Trojan War, and Helen never even bothered to once write her a letter of apology or send her some flowers as condolences. So when Helen finally arrives at Rhodes, Polyxo has several of her handmaidens dress up as the goddess of vengeance Furies, and they take Helen, rough her up a bit, and then hang Helen to death from a tree as revenge for the death of Tlepolemus and the countless others who died directly or indirectly for her actions. This bloody and torturous end is my personal favorite ending to the life of Helen, as I feel that after causing the death of such honorable figures such as Priam and Hector, that she does not deserve a happy ending to her life. But that is just my personal opinion. Let me know in the comments down below which theory is your favorite and what you think happened to Helen after the fall of Troy. And lastly, remember, if you want to explore the death of history's greatest figures, then subscribe to my channel Historical Exit, and thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.